It's really an honor to be here with somebody like Susan Isaacs, who has been, a sort of singular, amazing voice in writing and crime writing, and a particular woman's voice that I want to talk about with Susan. She is the author of 12 best-selling novels. Three have been made into movies: Compromising Positions, Shining Through, and After All These Years. She's a recipient of the Writers for Writers Award and the John Steinbeck Award. She's the chairman of the board of Poets and Writers, and she's a past president of the Mystery Writers of America. She's also had her work translated into 30 languages. She's I was, it's funny because I do interview a lot of the crime writers who come here, and I don't know, I've known Susan somewhat over the years, and I don't know if it's because of that or the fact that her books always make me both put me in a great mood and make me laugh, that I feel really comfortable to be with Susan, as I always do. Her new novel, by the way, Takes One to Know One, which I just finished, is absolutely terrific. And I was reading to Susan an email from my sister-in-law, who doesn't live here, saying this book is exactly what I needed in this time in our history. It's just so wonderfully written. It's a great plot, and I've been laughing for days. So with that, Susan Isaacs.
Hi.
Hi, Susan. So you made the trip. You had a little trouble. I heard you were almost hijacked.
Right,
but
right.
You were okay.
No, there was the formerly known as Kosciuszko Bridge, now Kosciuszko Bridge.
Oh, they've changed that.
Yes, there was a crash.
Oh, I
see.
Okay. I was just saying, and it's something that I want to talk about. Your new book fits into this as well, but I think that, when I think about, young women whose voices have become very important in literary work. And, I was talking to my friend Megan Abbott, who is very much, writes a lot about young women and how Gillian Flynn changed some things. But you really were doing this, from your very first book,
right.
You created the kind of woman we hadn't seen on the page, kind of, protagonist, and writing it in a very particular way that I think, so maybe we'll talk about that a little bit, how you came to write your first novel and how close that voice is to a voice that you had in your head, or how you invented that.
I had been an editor at 17 magazine, and I also did freelance political speech writing, both of which actually helped me become a better writer. 17 because we got letters from all over the country. I wrote about teenagers and got to see what it's like to be, 17 in Green Bay, Wisconsin, which was different from my experience. And political speech writing, in the late 60s and 70s, politicians still wanted to sound like JFK. And I had to tell these guys from Brooklyn and the Bronx and even parts of Manhattan, you're not JFK, but I'm not Theodore Sorensen. So let's do the best with what we have. And I learned a lot about voice, and to try to get the characters to speak in their own voices, and then I just try to up them a little bit and maybe give them a little humor, which, sometimes was difficult.
How long did you do speech?
I did it on and off for about 4 or 5 years. In those days, there weren't a lot of women doing that, or very few women, and you really had to hang out with the guys, with the politicians, for them to trust you. And when I was, you know, I was married. I was, at that point, when I was working for one of them, I was 7 or 8 months pregnant, and you don't want to hang out then, you know, and go to the Friendly Sons of Limerick dinner, you know. So so anyway, so how did I come? I was in the suburbs. We moved to the suburbs. I had been born in Brooklyn, lived here 12 years. Then we basically moved, you know, we were easternly mobile, and we moved to Queens. And I'd never not lived in an apartment. So we moved to the suburbs, and I had to give up my job. Basically because it was very difficult to find a full-time person that I felt comfortable taking care of the baby, but also because I wanted to be with the baby. I discovered that I loved him. He was wonderful, but scintillating was not. And so he was born, and then my daughter was born, and I started reading mysteries. I had always read a few of them, but I considered them plain reading. And then as I was reading more and more, I found that not only did I love the what's going to happen next, I love the writing. I think there's some terrific writers, often with humor, although you can't say that about the noir books have a little humor. Yeah, but not, you know, let me grab you by the lapels and make you chortle. So I was reading 3 or 4 mysteries a day and probably became slightly deranged. But I said, there's that moment when a reader starts moving into becoming a writer where you say, I think I can do this. And so.
But you had already been writing because you were.
Well, yes, I knew I could write a simple declarative sentence and get paid for it, but I hadn't written any fiction before, so that was new. But what I had was a character come into my head and say, I can. Let me be with you because I'd like you to tell my story. And the character was pretty clear to me. The story I knew would be a mystery because I loved them. It was a natural, because there's a straight narrative line through the plot. It doesn't go meandering into fields of daisies a la the Victorian novel. And because it just seemed, you know, who am I to write a novel? I'm not Virginia Woolf. I'm not Joyce Carol Oates. So, you know, I figured if you're not thin, you write mysteries. And
You know, Joyce Carol Oates has written a few mysteries. She's pretty thin. So.
Well, so I got a book. I don't know if it's still in print, called Writing a Novel by a British author, John Brain, who I had known as a playwright, who wrote a play called Room at the Top.
Oh, sure.
He was one of the angry young men. But he had calmed down when he wrote the book. And it was very useful. Whether you buy a book, take a class, however way you approach it, it gives you permission to write, and it creates in you the expectation that you have to produce. So he made it simple. Write out a list of characters' names. So I could do that, and then, but as I was writing out the names, new characters started, and I decided that I decided to kill off a periodontist. Because on the thought of who better deserves to die.
Right.
And I named him Bruce Fleckstein just because it pleased me, but then I made him M. Bruce Fleckstein. And I was, so little by little, by doing that, and then it said write an outline of no more than, I forget, 3 or 5 pages. So I did that. Well, essentially, you're developing the structure of the book. And for me, I mean, it made it less frightening because I knew that there was an ending that was related to the beginning of the book.
So you had a kind of blueprint, or just sort of the
I
ending?
had a blueprint.
Oh, you did.
Most of the middle of the, it was like the foundation and the roof were okay, but the middle was this amorphous thing that kept changing. But whatever it was, I worked it out. And then the best thing that happened to me was that my daughter, our daughter, my husband is there, our daughter, right? Went off to preschool. And she was gone for 3 hours a day. The school bus came into the driveway, picked her up. 3 hours later, they dropped her off. I set the kitchen timer. I worked in our, where was it? Was I working in the basement then? I was working in the basement. He actually built me an office right next to the laundry room.
That was, well, to make sure you kept doing
Well, it was the only
laundry.
place we had. Yeah, right. And no, the laundry. Forget laundry. So.
And I'm assuming that your son was already in
Yes,
school.
he
You
was
didn't
already
give
in
him
school.
away,
He
right?
was
Okay.
no. We kept him.
That's good.
He's still around.
Yeah.
And and
I have a question though about this.
Yeah.
So, okay, so you moved. Let's say you were somewhat moved without. You were moved out to Long Island. It was hard. There you were with kids.
Right.
It's the Diary of a Mad Housewife kind of thing. Do you think? It's a terrible question, but that was the strong impetus for you to write this book? Or?
Yeah, well, it was an impetus. I don't know what the strong was. I tried actually get a part-time job as an editor in publishing, and they didn't do part-time jobs for women then. You couldn't work at home, and so I really was at. And at 17, I could have come back. I was a senior editor, but they gave a 2-week maternity leave. Their theory was women who want to work keep working, and women who want to do, who aren't serious about it who will eventually leave. After the baby gets 102 temperature, forget them. So there was no incentive really to stay there. So I liked it. I was happy to have a house. I was happy that our kids were going to public school. At the time, which was the early 70s, the New York school, well, listen, it's still not perfect, but the particular neighborhoods we wanted, the schools were in a sorry state, and in a sorrier state because of the funding. So, but we wanted our kids to go to public school, and public school in a neighborhood that had some. There wasn't the word diversity, but there was mixed. So we wanted. That's how we wanted to live, and we found this community. So it was all very nice, and the other mothers were nice, and everyone was pleasant, and you know, everyone, but everyone was kind of alike, you know, no matter what your ethnicity, religion, race, everybody looked like they were just missed being in a Ralph Lauren ad. And I felt isolated.
Yeah.
Your friends tended to be the friends of kids who were in your kids' class, and it wasn't like Brooklyn. It wasn't like the city. You either there wasn't a place to. There were no Starbucks. There was no place to hang, and which is the reason I read so many mysteries.
But of course, it all did you a favor because
It
it
did, of
isolated you
course.
to be able to write the book.
Right,
You know, there you
right,
were with
and
nothing-
also to observe the community,
Yeah.
because as you know, I had been a writer, but I was also an only child, and you know, just an observer. So what I got from never having lived in the suburbs, I was looking at it. I was getting my master's degree. I wasn't ready for a doctorate, but and so it gave me, you know, write about what you know. And so I wrote about suburban women who had a lot of education and too much time and too much disposable income, and you know, who were touched by the women's movement, but not moved by it. It was not. Bless you, whoever. It was not a novel in the earlier feminist novel sense. It was just because by that time there had been so many of those, and it could sort of be taken for granted, and also there was an ordinariness about the suburbs that I wanted to capture. That these were not revolutionaries. There is an affair in the first novel, but it's not, you know, my lout of a husband and my this and my that. And the whole arc of the book is her finding freedom through an extramarital affair. And, you know, well, I suppose that's, you know, a nice way to, you know, spend an afternoon. It's not necessarily a real means of actualization or whatever they call it.
How long? So did you mainly work for 3 hours a day?
It took me 13 months. It took me 13 months because of that 3 hours a day. And this is why I say, if they say, you know, I could go on about my advice to writers.
Well, you could.
But I'm not going to have a preschooler and send them away. But I do think that you have to view writing as a job. Writing as a job. And the fact that I went to it 5 days a week, 3 hours a day, was significant because that was all the time I had. Once they got older, once they were in school till 3 o'clock, once they were off to college, and you know, there was just, you know, it was it was
Well, suddenly
different.
you
I had
the
to.
luxury of time.
We
In a
have the
different way,
luxury
right?
of time, but it's almost too luxurious. You have to
Yeah.
have a kind of Puritan strain in you, and say, this is my work time, and then also the need to be involved, so that early on, when I first started, my husband was working in the Southern District, which now is known. Nobody had ever heard of it, except they had, the Sovereign District of New York. But he was chief of the criminal division there, so he was good to work till 9, 10 at night. So I had the luxury after the kids went to sleep, and that was also my time not to write more, because I couldn't create at that time of the day, but I could mark up a manuscript.
Yeah, Mary Higgins Clark was here, and I don't know if you know her story. No, of course you know her, but I mean her story was,
Bismarck a Herring,
she had she had 5 children. Her husband died. She was writing for a radio show, and so she decided to write a novel, which she had been wanting to do. She would get her kids she would get up at 4 or 5 in the morning, because it was the only time she had before
Right.
Then she'd wake up her kids, feed them, get them to school. The reason I'm bringing it up is that I said, well, what about at night? And she said, at night, honey, I was drinking at night. Are you kidding? I had 5 children and no husband. But she kept that routine up for many
That's
years.
right.
Many years.
Yeah.
She had the same writing routine in the early morning.
It's also, it's a matter of, when it's possible, and if you can match that with your chronobiology, that's good. If not, then you write when you're a little sleepy, but you catch the.
So you were
the
writing
next
that.
day.
So that's pre-computers. You were
Yes.
writing on a typewriter.
Yes.
Right. And did you do a lot of rewriting?
Oh, yes. To me, to this day, my first drafts are not publishable. Self-publishable perhaps, but even then, I would be too cheap to waste my money on that. I would go over it and over it and over it, and retype it. It probably made it a better novel, but it got to a point after you've retyped it X number of times, you just can't face it again.
Yeah.
With a computer, there are no excuses.
No.
And if there's one word on page 197, you don't have to fear.
Right.
You can just change it. It's lovely. Actually, I got a giant computer in 1979. It was called an IBM display writer. It was, the size of an obese 6-year-old. And it had one of those IBM typewriter balls on top. And it just would, that was the printer. The computer was on this huge machine, was a small black screen with green letters. But it worked. It was, and because I had been at 17, you have to pass the typing test and type out everything right from the start, because they want you to, keep writing to, answering their reader mail. I really found it much faster and much more effective.
I'm curious this was your first novel. Compromising Positions was your
first novel,
and you sold it, and it became
yes.
a huge
It was
success.
turned down in about 5 places because it was Who Wants to Read About a Long Island Housewife. And what's good is that, there's that inner satisfaction when, the Japanese or the Bulgarian edition comes out, with someone. There's, I forget anyway, what was the question?
No, I'm just saying how, I mean, it's a tremendous success story.
It was a success.
You know?
Oh yeah,
I mean, so
it was.
yeah,
there was a big paperback. And they said they wouldn't buy it because it was funny and everything. But anyway, it became a publisher bought it. It was Times Books, which was then owned by the New York Times. They had never published a novel before. I was their first novel, which was really lucky, because they went to town and they took it. They have publishers my publisher.
They're all wonderful.
No, they are. Well, this particular one is, but they hand carried it to Book of the Month, where it became a dual main selection with The World According to Garp. And so I was a first-timer. John Irving had written a couple, but they didn't feel he was well-known enough, so they made us a pair.
Helped you both, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
and your protagonist only kills someone. She doesn't bite. Well, never mind.
No,
I don't want
she
to.
doesn't.
She's not Red Garp.
And no bears.
No.
Maybe a teddy. I don't know. But it became there was a big bidding war for paperback, and it went to lots of translations, and then it was bought for the movies.
Yeah.
So all that was good.
Absolutely. I want to just bring this to your new novel a little bit.
Sure.
We're skipping a lot of novels, although I do think that you have all of these amazing women protagonists in your books.
And I have a couple of males, and I have one male narrator.
Which book is that?
Magic Hour.
I read it. It's a while ago, though.
Yeah, he was. That voice came to me, and he said, and I said, yeah, I don't. I think you have the wrong person. But he didn't, and I loved it, and it really was successful, both in terms of of my feelings about it, about the reviews, and that men bought it. And except I was at a mystery writers event, and 2 guys who wanted to write a mystery came over to me. They were New York cops, and they said, "Hey, Sue," and I said, "Yeah," and they said, "The truth, your husband wrote this, right?" So.
Well, you could tell us now.
What?
You could, if it is.
He didn't write it.
No, I'm aware of that. I was definitely
so no, it was. So it's the voice, but it's before we get to my. It's not always a character for other writers. I mean, those of you who are regulars here know that there are some writers who, a word will come, or a story will come, or a writer will say, "What if X happened?" or something like that. So it's really idiosyncratic. So what happened to me is not.
Well, I was curious because you said this voice these voices sort of come to you. And I wanted...
Not like Joan of Arc.
No, I didn't. I didn't think that. I hope not.
No.
But In other words, a character comes together with more the character driven before your. I mean, with the first book, it was, I would say, plot driven in somewhat relation to the situation you found yourself in helped create that book. But
Right, right. But it was character driven, but you have to put the character in the right world.
right.
And in this case, this character wanted to solve a mystery. Um, with my next character, she didn't want to solve a mystery, and I made it a regular novel about politics, well, she was a speechwriter. So I was still writing about what I knew, but it was about, you know, sexual politics, family politics, and New York State gubernatorial politics, which, was assured a comic tone, and at the time. And so I would move from, I always liked mysteries. But then I wrote 2 espionage novels, Shining Through, and I think it's past perfect. And I've mixed them up. I wrote essentially Almost Paradise and Red, White, and Blue involve a saga form of going through generations, but it focuses both of them on 2 main characters, a man and a woman. So it's where they most want to be, or where they should be. When I had a legal secretary who's so smart, so madly in love with her boss, she didn't come alive until I put her in 1940. At the beginning, as when the world was at war, and that's where she fit. And then I did my research. Mm-hmm. This book was different. This was the first one that was different.
How do you mean?
Well, let me say, takes one to know one.
I'll hold it.
Okay. Oops.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So this one was different. A character didn't come to me, but a very strong plot came to me instead. And I tend to be introspective about, normal anxiety-provoking Jewish stuff, but I'm not, I don't think hard and, all right, it's a plot, fine. So I'll think up a character. So I knew I wanted it to be a series, and I knew that I wanted, because she had been in the FBI. She had left the FBI and had married and was now living a much more quiet life. And in that quiet life, both her training and her gut tell her that a neighbor is not right. Mm. So, okay, I created this, and again, bless you, I wanted her to have enough of a background, enough richness to sustain a series. So it's not the same essential book over and over again, and, tripping over, a body and, at the Roosevelt Field Mall. And I made her the daughter of an American diplomat, Egyptian mother. I did so, grew up in the Middle East um, and Europe. I wanted her to be an Arabic speaker. It was important because I wanted her to have been, I don't know why, but it was important that she be in the Joint Anti-Terrorism Task Force in New York. And I worked and I worked, and her family was interesting, her social life, her emotional life, really an interesting character. And 2.5 years into it, I was marking up my manuscript one night, and which I still do by hand, and I said, I hate this, which is, you know, when you spend your living, you know, your job as working alone in a room, you tend to talk to yourself. And so I said, I hate this. And then I heard what I said, and I was horribly upset, but I also knew that something like that wouldn't have come out if it weren't the truth. And that night I decided that I had to toss it. I mean, I wouldn't delete it from the computer, but I was going to toss it. And so I spent the next couple of weeks making instant pot soups and freezing them. And, you know, a watch pot and all that. And somewhere along the way, I was thinking, what sets off a story? And I was thinking about, you know, the first lines, "Call me Ishmael." I happened to be on a train going through Iowa in the middle of a terrible heat, or so. However, my Antonia starts. I forget the exact quote. And then I came to. I thought about the first sentence of Rebecca, which is, I dreamt something like, I dreamt last night I was back at Mandalay, and I thought, it just it's so elegant, it's so pure, it's so British. And then I thought, I dreamt last night that I was back on Queens Boulevard. and as I thought that, I became so happy. People say they laugh during. I don't laugh at my books because it's me. I live with me. I know me. It's not so funny. But I was delighted, and I realized that I had a character.
So I'm sorry, but did you actually dump that
Yes.
other? You did, and then you started again.
I kept the essentials of the plot, but that was it. I dumped every character.
I think that's really important for writers to hear.
I
To have to
But
do that
but
sometimes.
there's a difference between hating what you're writing because something's wrong or something's off, and then you go through that awful, maybe I should change it to third person, or whatever you go through. But essentially, the story is right, that there's something small that's wrong, and you've lost your way, or you've lost your nerve. But with this, I kept going over and refining, and really just and doing this drunken white thing, cutting out adjectives and all, and that didn't sound like me, because there's a reason for adjectives, and I try to use every one.
Yeah. When you found this new
when I found
Found the
this
thing
new
you- then the
character,
book just-
she was right. It didn't just whoosh. I mean, it was really having to create around that basic plot, which was, you know, what that I've told you. It took me over 2 years again, but it was worth it because I was engaged with her. I loved her relationships. I loved her best friend. I loved her relationship with her
I was
father.
just going to ask you about
Yes.
fathers and daughters.
Yes. Her father is a retired NYPD detective who retired after 2001 because his partner had been killed, and he's been depressed ever since. Her mother's an actor. At her peak, she had half a season in Days of Our Lives, and you know, does commercials, does what she can, and they live on Queens Boulevard. She grew up there, and it's, for me, terra cognita. So
Yeah, it feels like it's interesting because it reads so easily, deceptively so that it feels like, well, it feels like you had a good time writing it. You know, that you just.
I did, and it brought back my own father, who was not a cop, but who was an electrical engineer. But we had a great relationship, and at one point, Corey Geller, who is the narrator of the book, says I was never his princess. I was his pal, and I think that's key to their relationship. It was key to my relationship with my dad. That when you have a father who, I mean, it's nice if a father says, "Oh, you look so pretty," you know, but it's nicer to have a father who wants to spend time with you, and you know, teach you how to go fishing or make bookshelves. So I wanted to write about that, and she goes to him with her suspicions about this guy. It's a guy in her suburban. She has a lunch group in the suburbs of other. She freelances scouting contemporary Arabic fiction for 3 literary agencies. And so these are a lot of other people who have various freelance jobs. They all work at home, so they have something to unite them. And this guy she suspects is a packaging designer, and he has some quirks, but he seems really overly ordinary, really bland to a stunning degree. But she wonders, is this my unsatisfied need for adventure again? Or, you know, I'm hiding part of my life. I'm keeping, you know, my days in anti-terrorism back. Or does it take one to know one?
Well, I think it's interesting. I didn't know that you were starting a series with this, and it's interesting because she sort of has all those components. You know, FBI, ex-FBI. I also thought that both of her parents were great sort of characters to that you can use, and the best friend is very fun. So, but I'm gonna
based on someone we know, slightly.
Maybe so. Maybe so. I just want to see if some people had some questions for Susan. About yes, right there. You're going to get. There's a woman right there.
Sorry, I just want to make sure I'm following the different stories. The one I know, because there's a lot of stories. The one that you said you started with plot first, is that the one that you ended up having to dump?
This is only this one.
Yeah. So
Takes one to know one.
I happen to be a character-driven person myself. Do you think that not starting with the character was why you had to like go back and redo it because you didn't have a firm grasp on her first?
Probably. It was part of it at least because I I think I thought about it too much. I was too cerebral. Um, there's a time, certainly there in writing, there's a time for intellect. But I chose her because she had a very sophisticated background. She could be comfortable any place in the world, etc. But when it came down to it, she was too worldly for me, and I couldn't write her effectively. Um, Ian Fleming could write James Bond because he knew that world. You know, I don't I don't play baccarat. I don't whatever it is. I don't do that.
But you had written the whole book.
But I'd written almost 95%, and I was just at the point where I was going to have the final couple of chapters that, let's say, and afterward this happened, and I couldn't do it. So, so if there's nothing wrong if you don't have a character and you're sitting around and a plot comes your way,
Sure.
then
Yeah.
but
You think maybe not having her voice, like, I
right,
guess, cemented in your own personal context
right,
is what made it not
right,
quite work.
exactly.
Somebody else? Right. Oh, right there and then right here.
Of the ideas that come to you, how do you know when one's book worthy? Do you have any tricks that like it sticks long enough or something in some way?
If it stays for more than a few days and starts to grow, an incident will come in, another character will join up. This is even before you start your outline, if you do use an outline. But as I said before, the only way to find that, because so many things will go through your head, is to just have a regular work time. If you already have a job, then writing becomes your second job. And if you have a regular job and kids, it's your third job. But it's hard as hell, but it's been done. I stress the regularity just because there are so many reasons not to write. There's fear of success, fear of failure, there's laundry, there's so many things that make demands on you. So I think as you sit down, you'll discover,
Can I just piggyback onto that?
Sure.
What you just started to talk about is how, finding a book and when if you want to stay with a book. I mean, there are lots of times, I imagine, or times, not lots of times, hopefully, that you're writing something for a little while and you realize, well, maybe this is not,
right,
right?
Right.
And that you can't go further with it, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. I mean, if it feels false, and in terms of write about what you know, it doesn't have to be your life at that moment. It doesn't have to be about your life. There's a wonderful writer sitting in the audience, Matthew Sharp, and whose story, the first book of his that I read, was about you know, essentially about two young people. And, he wasn't that young when he wrote it. I mean, it was, he had the breadth, he had the depth, he had the memory, and he had his imagination. So you just have to use whatever you have. But yeah, sometimes, if you think it stinks, chances are it does.
Yeah, right, right. And you're the one who's going to have to work on it.
Right,
For the next
that's right. And
whatever.
and,
So
and you'll know. Generally, pretty soon. That's why the first
yeah.
variation of this, which wasn't even called "Takes One to Know One," was it took me so long because it was interesting. Interesting is, it's like saying someone wants to fix you up on a date and they say, oh, he's really interesting or she's really interesting. You kind of know that this is not going to be a plus.
There's a woman here who has a question.
Hi.
At the very beginning, you mentioned the process for the first book you did, compromising positions, that your husband was. You guys can hear me.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
That, I'm from Brooklyn. I don't use my.
yeah, use it anyway.
From the very beginning,
Yeah.
during the process when you were writing your book, Compromising Positions, you mentioned that your husband held a post as a chief of.
Criminal division.
Correct. And you mentioned that at nighttime, you didn't write, but I was curious as to whether or not you would pick his brain
Oh,
or ask him
constantly.
or ask him what
Constantly.
he did, like, hey dear, how was your day? And use some of those things
I didn't
from
even wait till he came home. I would call him.
and did they inject themselves in the stories?
No, in fact, he said what he likes about this book is that the murder victim is not the husband. But no, but I call him my house counsel. And yes, it's wonderful to have someone who's been in law enforcement or to be able to answer questions about legal procedure, criminal law. And also through him, I knew some FBI agents. I also am a great believer in taking a cop to lunch. In my case, I called up the Nassau County Police Department, asked for their public relations, said, I'm a writer, and I'm doing a book. Is there any way I could interview a homicide detective? And they said yes. And so I took this guy to lunch, and he didn't eat that much, and he talked a lot. And besides getting the facts, and I had my questions prepared, what I got was a feeling for him and a feeling for the language he used and the way he talked and the way he held himself and the way he talked about the other people. And now he was not the archetype cop. I mean, there were many, there's many different kinds of members of the police force as, there are in any other profession. But if you speak to a few people and you remember this or remember that, it pays to do your homework. When I was writing Red, White, and Blue, which takes place half in Wyoming, and I did have a cattle. I have that glottal, that New York City glottal, stop cattle, C-A-T-T-L-E question. I called up, I couldn't get the person in Wyoming, so I called Idaho. I got some lady who was the head of the Cattlemen's Association, and she gave me all the answers to cattle, and I got the language, and it was just a tiny, tiny bit of the book. It was maybe 3 sentences, but it enriched my understanding of that world. So sometimes just besides doing your research online or in a library, it's the talking to people. That's great. Yeah.
Yeah. I think also when I often would think about, well, there's going to be somebody who knows about cattle, and that person you're going to lose when they read your book if you're not, if you know, if
Right.
you haven't done it well.
Yeah.
But it's also for you, as you said, because it gives you something, you know.
And it
to sort
makes your world authentic. I went, bless you, again, I went to the Jackson Hole Writers Conference to speak, when it was a couple of times. And I love Wyoming, and it was wonderful there. And one of the students there said she grew up on a ranch in Montana, and she bought Red, White, and Blue just so that she could laugh at how a New Yorker writes about Wyoming. And she said, "You got us." And that was the best of all the compliments I got. That was my favorite.
Was there another question somewhere over? Yes.
Yes. Okay.
What was the hardest book for you, and why?
What was the hardest book for me and why? It was Lily White, because I used two different voices. I used first and third person. And I alternated chapters a good deal of the time through the book. And I had the first person voice narrating it, and then I had the third person voice saying, "Listen, she's not telling you the whole story. And the truth is, she doesn't know the whole story. And here's what happened." So it was it had to be planned out. It took me a year to write the outline. And I was petrified. I was convinced that I would never, that I'd spend the rest of my life on the outline, or that, who knows, you do get crazy. But it worked, and it was worth the time. And it was a good book.
Do you outline most of your books?
I outline all of them simply because, it's you learn to put on, when you're a kid, you learn to put your roller skates on a certain way, and you always put your roller skates on a certain way. It's the same thing. For me, it's the same thing. It's sort of, yep, it's tight, it's right, I feel confident, I know where I'm going to wind up. I have author friends, mystery writer friends who will say, I always write the ending first. I have mystery writer friends who say, I just start and keep going because I don't want to know the end. I want to surprise myself. So
do you have very detailed outlines, and do you deviate from your outline?
I always wind up deviating at some point. They're more detailed now than they were, because very often I'll think of a phrase or just some interesting little side thing, and I've put it into the outline just so I don't lose it. So the outline becomes very long, but I don't care. I'm the only one who's seeing it. And as far as deviation goes, I once finished a novel, didn't like the way it ended, rewrote the whole denouement and end, and then years later, CBS wanted to make a series, and they called in a producer. The producer said to me, "You pitch it." I had never pitched. I didn't even know what a pitch was, but they said, "Talk about the book." So but first I decided it might be well to reread it. So I reread it, and I realized I had no idea who'd done it, and it wasn't the person I thought it was going to be, and I was delightfully surprised. So, you see, I do deviate.
Clearly. I think, okay, one last question right here. And then you have to buy books, before they're extinct.
How do you decide when it's best to write your story in first or third person? Is it based on the complexity of the character and their ability to tell the entire story? What gives you that, I guess, the idea that this is the right person to write the story in?
Good question. I can't say I truly know, but most of my characters come to me speaking in their own voice, and their own voice is clear enough that they can tell the story. With Lily White, she didn't know everything that was going on, so that I needed this. And with Almost Paradise and Red, White, and Blue, there was this, I was giving the family history. It was going, so because it had that overarching view, I needed a third person. So if it's a larger story, far more than the character can possibly know, to me, then it would call out. Now, there are loads of ways of getting around that. If you want to write it in first, you can say, so-and-so told me. You can make it a narrator who's kind of like in The Great Gatsby, Nick Carraway is outside of the immediate story, but he's still in it. But he observes all the characters. So you can have that kind of narrator. But it's, I think if you listen to the voice, and if the voice is clear enough and interesting enough and has a viewpoint, has an opinion, because the story in most of my novels, I don't tell a whole life story. I tell the portion of the life that is most important. So the character is generally able to narrate it, but that's my choice. It's like no two people make chicken soup alike. Everybody. I'll put in a little dill, or someone says, "Give me some ginger," a little piece of ginger. So there are so many ways of doing things that you have to do what's right for you. And that's it. Sure.
Okay, so where do we go for books, for Susan to sign books? The cafe did invent a drink specifically for Susan, and I was here last night. They were trying them out. They said, "This is very weak." I had two. I stumbled home, but it was a really great drink. So I think it's called Picket Fence.
Picket Fence.
So I recommend them, even though I almost didn't get home. But thank you, Susan.
Oh, it's great. You've been great. Thank you.
We're really glad you were dragged to the suburbs too.
Yeah, well, me too.
All right, thanks.